For a while, I'd been toying with the idea of picking up a side gig. The semester had wrapped up, and I was swimming in free time with not much to do. Figured I might as well make some money while I had the chance. So I fired up LinkedIn and dove into the listings, hoping to find something easygoing. Ideally, I wanted a job where I could get away with half paying attention, maybe scrolling through my phone while on the clock. I spent hours combing through an endless stream of options. Most of what I found were things like graphic design gigs, tutoring offers, and restaurant jobs. Either I didn't have the right skills, or I just wasn't interested. Just as I was about to close the app, feeling defeated, I stumbled across a post for a babysitter. The post was short and mysterious, just an address and a phone number. Normally, I'd skip right past something that vague without a second thought. But I noticed that the address was barely a block from my place. Figured I might as well give it a shot. The call barely rang before someone picked up. "For the last time, I'm not doing any of your dumb surveys." I could hear the chaos in the background. A loud TV, the hum of a vacuum cleaner, and a kid wailing. I'm calling about the babysitting job." I felt a pang of uncertainty about what I was getting into. I had never babysat before, and judging from the sounds on the other end, I might be diving in at the deep end. Oh? Oh, yes, the babysitting job. Thank God. It's been a nightmare trying to find someone. Look, I'm running late, and I've got a mile-long list of errands to do. If you can get here in half an hour and keep an eye on my kids for a few hours, 3, maybe 4, 5 tops, I'll pay whatever you want. Part of me felt a little sorry for the guy. He sounded desperate. The other part of me wondered what kind of disaster I'd be walking into. And then there was the part of me fixated on the phrase, "I'll pay you whatever you want." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I replied. 15 minutes later, I was standing outside apartment 4H. The whole building seemed dated, probably put up sometime in the 80s, but the red wallpaper, mahogany accents, and plush carpet in the hall gave it a bit of a high-end, hotel-like feel. I could hear the same storm of noise from the call raging inside. I almost turned around, but I was already here. I lifted my hand to knock, only for the door to swing open right as I did. "Oh, hey, you're the babysitter, right?" The man in front of me wasn't what I'd imagined. He wore a clean navy blue suit and had a tall, muscular build. Despite the deep bags under his eyes, his untidy curls, and a rough-looking stubble, he actually had a certain charm to him. "Yep, that's me," I answered. "Quick on your feet. Caught me off guard," he laughed. "Come on in." I followed him through the apartment to the living room, where I was met with the sight of 2 little boys, probably 7 or 8 years old, in a tug-of-war over a green toy soldier. The entire carpet was littered with army figurines and toy tanks. Amid the chaos, I barely noticed a little girl in a black dress sitting on the couch, perfectly still, her eyes fixed on an episode of MasterChef Junior playing on the TV. "All right, kids, calm down for a sec," the man said firmly. The 3 kids stopped what they were doing and swiveled their heads in unison to look at me. "All right, your dad's going to be away for a little bit, okay? This nice lady here is Emily." "Right. Emily's going to watch over you while I'm gone. She's in charge, so I expect you all to behave yourselves this time." The kids responded with an enthusiastic silent nod in sync. "Good." Then he turned back to me. "Emily, let me introduce... Well, actually, just meet Zelos." He pointed to the boy in the white shirt. "And Martius, the one in red. They're twins. And that's Limos, the girl over there." Those were some unusual names, I thought. Each child gave me a little wave as their name was mentioned, and I awkwardly waved back. "All right then," he continued. "Bathrooms down the hall. First door on the left." He gestured toward a hallway with 4 doors. 1 on the left, 2 on the right, and 1 at the end. "And feel free to grab whatever you want from the fridge. Make yourself at home. Just don't go into the room at the end of the hall. That one's off limits." "Not a problem," I assured him. "You might hear something from inside," and a loud buzzing cut him off as he scrambled in his pocket and pulled out a phone. Darn it, I really need to go. Without looking up from his phone, he handed me a thick stack of cash from his wallet. "Here, this'll cover some takeout if they get hungry." Before I could think of any questions, he had already slipped out the door. I had to respect a worn-out dad just trying to make it through the day. But leaving me, a total stranger, alone with his kids, it seemed a bit careless. I turned back to find the three kids staring at me with expressionless faces. "Well, looks like I'm outnumbered here," I joked, hoping to lighten the mood. They stayed silent. Limos lost interest and looked back at the TV, but the boys tilted their heads and sizing me up. Oddly enough, I felt like they were looking down at me. "So how's the battle going, soldiers?" I tried again to ease the tension. "Would you care to join us?" Martius asked. "No!" Zelos shouted, cutting him off. "Father said she's in charge," Martius reminded him. Zelos glared, clearly unhappy with the idea of letting an outsider into their game. Sensing it was best to stay neutral, I figured I'd take things easy for the next few hours. "No worries, I'll pass, but thanks for the offer. You guys carry on." I stood up straight, narrowed my eyes, and gave them a sharp salute, doing my best soldier impression. "Very well," Martius replied, saluting back. I joined Limos on the couch. Up close, I noticed she looked frail, almost too thin, to the point where I worried she might be sick. "Anorexia, maybe." The little girl spoke up softly, barely above a whisper. "Can we eat? I'm hungry." "Of course, sweetheart," I assured her, trying to sound as caring as possible. Maybe some pizza would do her some good. We sat waiting for the pizza to get there. In the meantime, the boys stayed in their battle zone, and Limos lounged on the couch next to me, her shallow breaths the only sign she was there. I couldn't help but find it kind of charming that the boys weren't just bashing the tanks together or hurling toy soldiers across the room like you'd expect for kids their age. They acted like serious commanders in the Great Living Room War, as if they were carefully leading their troops to meet their fate on the no-man's land carpet. They moved around the battlefield, hands on their chins, making sure not to step on any of the plastic soldiers. Glancing over at Limos, I saw her wide-eyed, fixated on the TV as if she was completely entranced by the cooking show. Even though pizza was on the way, I figured I'd look around in the kitchen to see if there were any snacks to hold us over. As soon as I got up, Zelos noticed. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked sharply. "Just gonna check if you guys have any snacks." "Those aren't for you, stranger. Do you think you can just waltz in here and take what you like?" Now, I'm the first to admit I don't always act my age, but something about his bratty attitude got to me. "Pretty sure your dad said I was in charge and to help myself," I replied, laying on a mock posh accent as if I were some kind of royal. "Bitch!" I couldn't believe it. A kid that young using that kind of language. Part of me wanted to set him straight, to teach him some respect and make him apologize. It didn't feel like myself at all, though. I'd only come here to make a few easy bucks. Why should I care about insults from a kid? But right then, I did care. Trying to look a bit intimidating, I stomped my foot hard, hoping to startle him. As I did, a sharp pain shot through my leg. I dropped back onto the couch and lifted my foot to see what had happened. Sure enough, I'd stepped on a toy soldier's bayonet. The little green guy's arm was nearly torn off, hanging by a thin strip of plastic. Gritting my teeth, I pulled the tiny bayonet out, leaving a faint red stain on my sock. "Shoot," I muttered, almost to myself. I looked up to see both Zelos and Martius staring at me. Zelos, predictably, looked furious about his broken toy. But Martius gazed down at the wounded soldier, his bayonet now tinged red, with a sorrowful expression. "Hey, I'm really sorry, guys," I said, the irritation I'd felt fading fast. "I'll get you a new one, I promise." "That's not how this was supposed to go," Zelos exploded. "Come on, Zelos. I'll replace it for you the next time I come, all right?" "He cannot be replaced," Martius murmured, kneeling down and carefully picking up the broken toy soldier. He walked over to a small jar on the coffee table. Inside, I noticed a pile of green plastic pieces, hands, feet, heads, and torsos. Martius gingerly placed the wounded soldier on top of the pile. "You know, you guys really shouldn't leave these all over the floor." Martius shot me a furious look in response. "I do not care if you're in charge. It is not fair." I did something I immediately regretted. I let out a little laugh. There was something funny about how seriously they were taking their imaginary war. I tried to stifle it, but it was too late. Both twins were fuming. "Look, I'm really sorry, guys. I swear I'll make it up to you." "You do not understand," Martius said, his voice grave. "This is not a mistake that is easy to fix. However," He stopped and looked over at Zelos. The two exchanged a silent look, and after a moment, Zelos, his eyes starting to fill with tears, nodded solemnly. Zelos reached into his pocket and pulled out another toy soldier. He handed it over to Marius, who brought it to me. This one was different, a bit shorter and with a smaller build. It was a female soldier, dressed in the same detailed uniform and carrying the same gear as the rest of the figures. This was the first time I'd really taken a good look at these toys, and I had to admit they were incredibly detailed. The tiny green face, surprisingly intricate, looked back at me with an expression that struck a familiar note. Then it hit me. It looked exactly like me. Before I could get a closer look, Marius snatched the toy soldier from my hand. With purpose, he strode back to the center of the carpet battlefield, my soldier in hand. "Perhaps we can help you understand," he said, placing the little green figure down on the floor. "Wait, give that?" I began to protest. I never got to finish the thought. To this day, I can't tell what hit me first. The overwhelming smell, like sulfur and blood mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder. The thick, gritty taste of ash and smoke that filled my mouth. Or the piercing screams and rapid bursts of gunfire echoing around me. But what I remember most was the soldier in front of me. He was slumped in the mud and muck of a trench, and from just one look, I knew he was dead. His lifeless eyes, barely open, stared at me. His jaw hung slack, blood trickling from one corner of his mouth. The rest of him was twisted and broken, his arms barely attached by strips of tissue. Yet his hand still gripped his rifle, bayonet fixed in place. Only moments ago, I had been in a quiet, dimly lit apartment in the middle of the city. I blinked, and now I was in a cold, wet trench surrounded by horror. The mud beneath me was saturated, either with rainwater or worse. Coldness seeped through the uniform I now wore, and sinking deeper into the muck felt like the only comfort. Like maybe, if I could stay perfectly still, I'd be just another corpse among the countless others. So I lay there trying to stop my body from shaking, clenching my teeth as I stuffed my fingers into my ears. Filthy as they were, I hoped they'd help block out the horrific screams echoing around me, sounds barely recognizable as human. I took shallow breaths, each one tainted with a rotten, acrid stench all around. I stared at the dead soldier in front of me, and I'd have kept my eyes shut tight if I hadn't seen a flicker of movement. He blinked. My eyes flew open, locking onto his soulless gaze as his eyelids twitched. His fingers jerked slightly, his legs shifted just a bit. Then with a sudden, awful movement, he lurched forward, his spine snapping with a gruesome crack as he tumbled into the mud at my feet. I almost yelped, but the sound caught in my throat, leaving me breathless. It seemed as though he'd been knocked over by an explosion. But then his arm, barely connected by bits of exposed muscle and bone, flung upwards, and his hand latched onto my leg. I tried to scream, but all that came out was a dry, rasping gasp as my voice failed. I kicked, trying to free myself, but the dead soldier's grip only tightened. With a sudden, jerky motion, he yanked himself forward so that his broken torso collapsed onto my knees. His torn body pressed against mine, his face now right next to my ear as I turned away, desperate not to look. And then, over the deafening chaos, he whispered, a hoarse, broken plea. I beg you, release the pale rider." A bell rang, far away at first, like a distant echo. Then it washed over me, and in an instant, everything vanished. The screams, the stench, the mud, the soldier's corpse. I was back in the apartment, seated on the floor, leaning against the couch. It was so abrupt and surreal that I almost believed it had all been a hallucination. But then I saw Marius standing in his original spot, holding that small green soldier. He looked at me, not with anger this time, but with something almost like pity. I flinched as he walked over, stepping carefully across the carpet, and knelt down beside me. Gently, he took my hand and placed the soldier figure in my palm. I didn't need to look. I knew it was the one that looked like me. "Take better care of this one," he said, almost as if he thought I was the child here. The sound of the bell rang again, pulling me out of my daze. It took me a moment to realize it was the doorbell. Someone was at the door. "Pizza time!" Limos called out with excitement. Slowly, I got up from the floor, found my balance, and headed for the door. Now I'm sure a lot of people in my position would have used this chance to bolt, and I had decided I'd do just that as soon as I opened the door. Get out of that cursed apartment with its unsettling children. Nothing could be worth what I'd just gone through. My pace quickened as I neared the door, hand reaching out to pull it open. But when I did, I was greeted by the scent of pizza and nothing else. Complete darkness filled the hallway where I'd first come in. No light except the faint glow spilling from the apartment. All that lay in the empty hallway was me and a pizza box on the floor. Dominoes. I hesitated, staring into the blackness. Maybe the power had gone out. That'd be fine. I knew where the stairs were, and I could still make my escape. Are you going to share? Limos's voice startled me. I jumped, nearly stumbling back into the dark hallway. She was standing in the doorway, and between us sat the pizza box, patiently waiting. Please, she pleaded softly. I'm so hungry. Her face showed raw desperation. The black dress she wore seemed to hang off her body, loose and ill-fitting. I was almost certain it fit her perfectly earlier, but now it looked a few sizes too big, as though she'd somehow shrunk. Please, she begged again, her voice thin and urgent. The pale one is close. That was it. The pale one again, this looming, terrifying presence they kept mentioning. The second I heard her words, I spun around and sprinted blindly down the dark hall toward where I remembered the stairs. There had to be stairs. My feet pounded the floor as I ran straight ahead, fully expecting at some point to crash into a wall. But no obstacles met me, and the hallway stretched endlessly. You can't outrun it, came Limos's voice again, clear and calm as if she were standing right beside me. But I had run so far, she shouldn't still sound this close. I skidded to a halt, out of breath, and turned around, half expecting to find her following me. But she hadn't moved. She was still standing in the doorway, the pizza box lying between us on the floor, as if I hadn't budged an inch. Somehow I was exactly where I'd started, a few steps out from the apartment. It's not the fastest, but it'll catch you, she went on, her gaze steady as I struggled to breathe. It always does. What is this? I demanded, my voice cracking as I shouted at her. Nothing about this made sense anymore, and any foundation I'd ever had to make sense of things was crumbling. What remained was a gut-wrenching mix of fear and anger, like a trapped mouse ready to lash out. It's pizza! What is this place? I shouted, the last shreds of my patience snapping. I'd never thought myself capable of hurting a child, but in that moment, I felt a raw urge to shake some answers out of her. Domino! Enough! I yelled, lunging toward her, not even sure what I intended to do. I reached for the collar of her dress, but she didn't step back, didn't flinch. Somehow she just shifted, subtly slipping out of my reach without moving. I fell hard to the cold, unyielding floor beneath me, catching the sting of pain as blood dripped from my nose. It wasn't even the soft carpet I remembered in the apartment. It was something solid, almost metallic. Lying there, stunned and bleeding, I looked up at the frail girl who now stood over me, her figure outlined by the apartment light, a shadow against the darkness. I felt defeated, pinned to the floor like it was the only real thing I could hold on to in this chaotic nightmare. What is this? I asked again, my voice barely a whisper, trembling. Limos crouched down to peer at me, her gaze curious, as if she were examining a bug she'd found scurrying across the floor. The path, she answered simply. What does that mean? Are you hungry? She asked, ignoring my question. There was a genuine care in her voice. I wanted to tell her food was the last thing on my mind, but the moment she asked, I suddenly felt a gnawing, ravenous hunger I hadn't realized was there. It seized me with such force my stomach twisted in pain, a deep ache. The smell of the pizza filled the air, rich and overwhelming, almost suffocating. I could practically taste it on my tongue. Yes, I whispered, unable to deny it. Are you strong? She asked next. I hesitated. How could I say yes when I was lying here, broken and bloodied? Do you want to live? Yes, I said, my voice trembling as I pleaded. Yes, please, let me live. Help me. I want to live too, she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the pizza box as she stepped forward. She gently lifted the lid of the pizza box, releasing the intoxicating smell of melted cheese, tangy tomato sauce, and savory pepperoni. My mouth watered instantly. Summoning the last of my strength, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, crawling toward the food that seemed to call out to me. But after a few moments, I noticed something strange. I wasn't getting any closer. It felt like I was on a treadmill, endlessly crawling without moving an inch forward. Frustrated and desperate, I tried to crawl faster, hoping to close the distance. Then I forced myself onto my feet, stumbling forward, gaining momentum until I was jogging, then running, then sprinting as hard as I could. Still, I stayed just out of reach. I could see Limos crouched over the pizza box, her back to me, eating slice after slice, each piece disappearing into her mouth before my eyes. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't going to reach her, and if I didn't, she'd finish the entire pizza without leaving me a bite. Panic flooded me as I watched her eat, slice after slice, until there was nearly nothing left. Down to the last slice, I pushed my body to the breaking point, leaping toward her in one final attempt to bridge the gap. I fully expected to crash to the floor again, helpless as before, but this time my body surged forward and I collided with her small, frail frame, toppling her to the floor beneath me. She cried out in shock and pain, and I felt her tiny arms snap under the weight of my knee. In that moment, I didn't feel pity, I felt satisfaction, as if this was retribution for everything she'd put me through. I turned my attention to the box only to find it empty. Rage boiled in me, and I looked back at Limos. Even with her broken arm, she still clutched that last slice, holding it tight in her small hand. I grabbed it from her without hesitation and shoved it into my mouth, desperate for some sense of satisfaction. But instead of the savory taste I'd expected, a wave of rot hit me, a vile, spoiled taste that churned my stomach. I doubled over, vomiting out the black sludge that remained in my stomach, along with the half-chewed slice. The pizza, I realized with horror, was covered in mold, spots of sickly green and purple, with maggots writhing in the cheese. My stomach heaved as I spat, trying to rid myself of the taste. "No!" Limos shrieked in horror as I convulsed over my own pile of vomit, racked with pain. Pinned beneath my knee, she began struggling, pulling at her broken arm with a sudden, unnatural strength. I watched in terror as steam rose from her elbow and her face twisted in determination. Inch by inch, she wrenched the fractured bone free from her flesh, like it was nothing but a sleeve, smooth as pulling meat off a bone. Her scream of pain mingled with a chilling triumph as she finally slid the bone out completely. Freed, she pushed me aside and, with her one good arm, scooped the vile mess of vomit and rotting pizza back into her mouth. The sounds of her slurping and grunting were raw, feral, no trace of humanity left in her at all. The gruesome display sickened me, but my eyes locked onto the steaming piece of flesh she'd left behind. Somehow I knew I was on the edge of something monstrous myself. It smelled like burned human flesh, the kind I remembered from the trenches. My hand reached out, almost involuntarily, to touch it. It was piping hot, and when I picked it up, the meat gave way, peeling apart like pulled pork. Suddenly, a shadow cast over me. A figure loomed nearby, blocking out the light from the apartment. "Pathetic," came the disgusted voice of Zelos, who looked down at me with pity and scorn. I could only imagine how wretched I looked to him. Then, without another word, he shut the door, plunging me into complete darkness. I lost track of time. The disturbing sounds of Limos's feeding soon faded into silence, but her presence lingered, filling the space with a sense of inescapable dread. I sat there, my hands still clutching the hot, moist piece of her flesh, the only solid thing left in this surreal, unchanging void. My hunger gnawed at me, stronger than ever, but I couldn't bring myself to eat what was in my hand. The very thought was vile, an abomination. Starvation, I thought, would be a more merciful end. But survival, some primal, relentless urge, drove me forward. As tears ran down my cheeks, I slowly lifted the piece to my mouth. The darkness spared me the horror of seeing it, but I could still feel it, smell it. I choked on the bitter, gamey meat, my sobs racking my body as I chewed. Somewhere nearby, I heard faint shuffling, and I knew without looking that Limo stood beside me, silently watching. "You are strong," she whispered. In an instant, a bright light washed over me, blinding after the darkness. I squinted, and when I opened my eyes, I was back in the apartment. It was silent and empty. The TV was off, the toys scattered around the floor were gone, and I was alone. The gnawing hunger had faded away, leaving behind only the rancid aftertaste. I checked every corner, every shadowed space, but no one else was there. Maybe they'd retreated back to their rooms. I turned to the hallway where the bedrooms were, feeling an ominous dread creeping over me, as if something unspeakable waited behind each door. The thought of escape came to me again, this time more urgent. I was terrified of opening the front door and finding myself back in that hellish void, so I turned to the window instead. I could hear the familiar sounds of traffic and people outside, and it comforted me. I was 4 stories up. There was no safe way down. But at that point, I was willing to risk the fall. But no matter how hard I tried to lift the wooden frame, it wouldn't budge. There were no locks, nothing holding it shut, but it was stuck in place and as if glued by something supernatural. Desperation clawed at me. Grabbing the nearest heavy object, a desk lamp, I slammed it against the glass as hard as I could. Not a scratch. Defeated, I turned reluctantly to the front door again. Opening it carefully, I took a step outside, keeping my foot within the apartment. My heart pounded as I peered into the hallway, relieved to find it back to its original state. But as I stepped out, a sound cut through the silence. A faint, distant cry, like a baby's wail. The helpless sound filled me with an unexpected dread, and I sprinted toward the stairwell. My heart pounded as I took the steps 2 at a time, hurtling down until I burst into the lobby. But as I looked around, I found myself not in the lobby, but back outside apartment 4H. The baby's crying had grown louder, echoing through the hallway. I turned, expecting the stairwell behind me, only to find the same hallway on the 4th floor stretching out before me again. All hope drained from me. I sank to the floor, knees hitting the ground as I broke down into desperate, exhausted sobs. The infant's cries echoed endlessly as I wept, both of us trapped together. Time became meaningless. Hours, maybe even days passed, but the light from the window never dimmed, and the baby's wailing never ceased. I tried every possible way to escape. My phone had no signal, the stairwell led back to 4H, and every neighboring door opened only to reveal another empty version of apartment 4H. Even the elevator, no matter the button I pressed, always opened to the same room. Eventually, I realized I neither hungered nor tired. I simply existed in a timeless, unchanging space. My soul felt hollow and I could hardly recognize myself. I had done monstrous things to survive, but for what? Sitting on the kitchen floor, I held a kitchen knife, pressing its sharp edge lightly against my neck. My grip tightened as I closed my eyes. As I whispered those words, a strange sense of peace settled over me. My hands, which had been trembling, grew still. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe I could truly rest here, if only for a breath. It was as if the whole world around me had stilled too, like time itself had taken a step back to grant me this quiet, delicate reprieve. The woman, this ageless, childlike specter who had lingered at the edges of my sanity, looked so peaceful as she slept. Her breathing was calm, and a soft smile played on her lips, as if she'd finally found some relief as well. I wondered if she felt a similar kind of release, as if we'd both come to an unspoken understanding. Even in this strange, twisted reality, perhaps she too yearned for something familiar, something that could give her solace. I rose slowly from the couch, careful not to disturb her. I glanced at the photo she'd handed me, its edges fraying with age. The horses in the meadow seemed to be galloping freely, moving through the grass like spirits unbound. I tucked it carefully into my pocket, as if it were a charm that could remind me there was something else beyond these walls. As I turned to leave, I took one last look at her. "I hope you find peace," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. Then, as if propelled by an instinct I could barely understand, I walked toward the door. When I reached for the handle, I half expected it to refuse me, to lock me in this place forever. But it turned easily, and I stepped out into the hallway, into the blinding light spilling through the windows. The hallway stretched before me, and this time, it looked ordinary, mundane. No shifting shadows or looping paths. I made my way down the stairs, each step echoing in the empty silence. I kept going, almost afraid to look back. With each floor I passed, I felt myself letting go of that haunted space, releasing its hold on my mind, my body, my spirit. Finally, I reached the ground floor, and as I stepped outside into the sunlight, a gentle breeze brushed across my face. It smelled of earth, of fresh grass, of life. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was standing in the real world. No tricks, no illusions. I took a deep, steadying breath, and with each beat of my heart, I felt that peace grow. The aftertaste of that other world, the haunting melody of the poem, still lingered somewhere deep inside. But out here, with the sun on my skin and the wind in my face, I knew I could bear it. I walked forward, leaving the apartment and its mysteries behind, perhaps forever. The road ahead was mine for now, and I intended to take it one step at a time. I stared at the new image, a sense of dread filling my chest as I gazed upon the 4 children and the man who stood before them, bloodied and alone. The picture felt heavier in my hand, its dark message now etched into my mind. I turned it over, my heart racing as I reread those ominous words. The folly of Cain. A warning, or perhaps a curse. I couldn't be sure. The weight of it all, the apartment, the children, the man, and now this haunting photograph, felt like an anchor dragging me down. Yet here I stood on the bustling sidewalk, surrounded by people moving along with their lives, blissfully unaware of the shadows I had just encountered. I was the only one who had witnessed the darkness lurking in those rooms, who had faced the manifestations of humanity's deepest fears and flaws. Maybe this was the purpose of it all, a painful reminder of the cost of existence, of how we carry within us both the power to create and the capacity to destroy. The yearning for peace mingled with the inevitability of suffering. In the hushed stillness of that apartment, there had been a chance to let it all go, to surrender completely to the void. Yet out here, among the living, the challenge lay in enduring the relentless march of life, much like the man in the photograph, embodying both despair and fragility. For a moment I stood frozen, allowing the world to pass me by like a dream I couldn't grasp. The sounds of laughter, the cries of children, the honking of horns faded into a distant hum as I wrestled with the gravity of my revelations. Then slowly I tucked the Polaroid back into my pocket, feeling its edges dig into my chest like a second heartbeat, a reminder of what I had witnessed and what I now carried within. With each step forward, I felt a mixture of dread and resolve coursing through me. The memory of the child's gentle breath and the man's quiet resignation echoed in my mind, compelling me to confront the reality of my own existence. I understood then that I was not alone in this strange and unyielding journey. We were all bound together by our struggles, our hopes, and our unrelenting desire to endure. And so I walked on, my heart heavy with the weight of my experiences, but also buoyed by a flicker of something more, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Each day would be a battle, every moment a reminder of the shadows that lingered just beyond the light. Yet I was determined to keep moving forward. This was my choice, my burden to bear, and for now it was enough. As I merged back into the throng of life around me, I felt the pulse of the world, the laughter, the cries, the heartbeat of humanity wrap around me like a fragile cocoon. In that moment, I realized that despite the pain, the fear, and the shadows of my past, there was beauty to be found in every step forward. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of life could still flicker, and that was worth fighting for.